In this class we want to talk about problems with fiscal policy. Now, fiscal policy is simply government expenditure and government revenue, mostly in the form of taxation. So here we're discussing issues associated with government expenditure, government taxation, and the use of fiscal policy to bring about some objective. For example, smoothing out the course of the economy, getting rid of boom periods or slump periods, controlling the level of employment, regulating inflation or the balance of payments, using fiscal policy for some purpose, in other words, and what are the problems with using fiscal policy for that purpose. So, first of all, the Keynesians believed that government should intervene to correct problems with the economy. Now, Keynesians are named after John Maynard Keynes, who wrote his very influential book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, better known as the General Theory, in 1936. And Keynes was primarily concerned with the use of fiscal policy to regulate the economy, to control the economy, so as to avoid mass unemployment and to avoid all the major problems that had occurred in the West, in Western economies, in the interwar period. So the Keynesians were concerned that the government should use the fiscal policy and should intervene with increased spending when unemployment was rising. So the primary concern of Keynes was to control unemployment. So the government should intervene when unemployment was rising, and it should intervene by putting more money into the economy. Now, this normally entailed cutting taxation or increasing government expenditure. And in fact, what that normally bubbled down to, what that normally came down to, was the government putting more money in, government expenditure increasing. Now, the government receives its money, its income or its revenue from taxation, but it could also borrow the money on the markets, or it could print money in an extreme case. So the government should inject money into the economy when unemployment is rising. That was one of the fundamental principles that John Maynard Keynes tried to instill into politicians and into the country, and his followers, the Keynesians, believe this passionately. They should also decrease it when unemployment is falling. So what they're really attempting to do here is to smooth out a cycle. When the economy is going to a boom period, the fiscal policy should be to take resources out of the economy. And they do that by increasing taxation, which means we have less to spend, or by reducing government expenditure. So when the economy is in a slump, they put money in, and when it's booming, they take money out. It's the opposites. It's the opposite way around. And it's known as a counter-cyclical policy. Counter-cyclical because it's going in the opposite direction. Now let's look at the effects of fiscal policy. And when government increases its spending, for example, let's take this example. Now, when it does, then there are more goods and services required, and it increases its spending, so they are required, which means that more workers are required to produce these extra goods and services, which means that unemployment falls because more workers are required, and since more workers are required and unemployment's falling, then the consumers and producers' expenditure increases because more people are working. More people are working, more income in the economy. For a start, there is less government expenditure on welfare payments, and also people who previously were on welfare are now paying taxes towards the government. So if the government can start the whole process going by increasing its expenditure, more goods and services are required, therefore more workers are required, therefore unemployment falls, therefore There'll be more expenditure. That's all that's needed from the government. It just needs the initial push to get the system going in a particular direction. However, there are problems, and these are significant problems. The first is, how much should the government put in? So when the economy is entering into a recession, how much should the government spend if it's going to be an interventionist government as advocated by John Maynard Keynes? And secondly, when should it put it in? What's the right timing? Now, you have to remember here that governments only have the same information as really the rest of us, and governments are just individuals. They're just people who are elected into that position. So they don't know everything, and they can get it wrong. The same as you and I and anybody else could get it wrong. So there is a problem here. The big problem with the economy is that it fluctuates over time itself. If you just leave the economy alone, if there was nothing happening to the economy, we would find that it fluctuates. Historically, that's the case. If we draw a picture of that, a diagram of that, it would look something like that. You would have GNP on the vertical axis, time on the horizontal axis, and if I can just put the cursor onto the slide for a second, there you go. You can see that the economy is booming, entering into a slump, coming out of the slump itself. Nothing's doing this. The reason why it cycles, well, various explanations. One, it could be as the economy becomes more and more optimistic, more and more people invest. Eventually, there are constraints in the economy, constraints, production constraints, distribution constraints, and eventually they can't meet the orders on time because everybody's working flat out. So orders become frustrated. Eventually orders are cancelled, placed overseas. Word gets round that the economy is not working well. People start to cancel orders. People become pessimistic. At some stage, machinery need to be replaced. Stocks need to be rebuilt. Orders are placed to do that. Word gets round that orders are being placed, so the economy picks itself up, and off we go again. Now that's a possible explanation. As to whether it's accurate 100% or not, I'm not completely sure, but it's an explanation. But one thing for sure, if we look at the data, we do find ups and downs in the economy. Perhaps not as smooth or as pretty as I have drawn there, but there are ups and downs following a pattern, almost like a sine wave, but not necessarily as regular or as precise as the one I've drawn. But you find a pattern like this, and that's if there's no government intervention. Nothing's happening, just it's doing it on its own. In an ideal world, of course, what we would like to see is that we'd like to see a smooth line. That would be pretty good, because now we don't have this boom period where there's inflation and overtime working and lots of problems in the economy. Down here we don't have mass unemployment or increasing poverty. So it'd be nice if we could just even it out. So we take the boom period here and add it to the slump period over here and somehow cancel it all out, make it into a trend line. I suppose over time we would really like that trend line to be gently upward increasing, because we like to have more resources over time. But maybe perhaps that's what we're aiming for. Now, if we look at interventionist fiscal policy aimed at achieving that trend line, it might look something like that. So, as the economy is entering into a boom period, the government's cutting back on government expenditure, increasing taxes. Then the economy is lifting itself up. So here it's into a recession, and as it is, the government's pumping money in. As the economy is coming out, the effects of withdrawing fiscal stimulus here sets in, and so if you look at it, it's more or less joining up all of the points, and we have a trend line. So the fiscal policy is offsetting the cycles in the economy. It's offsetting the cycles and giving us this nice trend line. That's an ideal world. If there is a truly successful counter-cyclical policy, that would be the outcome. That's if it was truly successful. We wouldn't observe the cycles that we had earlier. It would just be the trend line. In truth, the government doesn't know when to intervene. The government doesn't know which part of the cycle we're on. Go back to this one for a second. The government doesn't know if we're here or there. Data is out of date. Statistics are out of date. So the government's using statistics collected 6 months ago, maybe a year ago. So it doesn't know exactly where we are. So we could be in a phase where the economy is dipping, but the government's picking up the phase here, and it thinks we're still expanding. So if it thinks we're still expanding, the economy is expanding, and it wants to stop inflation or stop a balance of payments problem, it might put the brakes on here. It might increase taxation here or cut government expenditure, which will just add to the down, making this a lot worse. And if we have a look at that, that could be the picture. It could be that the government sees the economy rising here. It doesn't know that it's going to dip on its own accord. It doesn't know when it's going to happen. So it has a counter-cyclical policy, so it cuts back government expenditure here, which is ultimately going to add to the downturn here. Then the economy is going to pick itself up here. The government doesn't know that, so the government adds to it. And you can see the amplitude of this cycle is becoming bigger. Here was the amplitude before, more or less constant. Now it's getting taller, and it's getting deeper. So the recessions are getting deeper because the intervention is wrongly timed. And here it's very high, and then we have a real slump. That's because the intervention was at the wrong time. Now, the government couldn't foresee that, so the best thing for the government is not to intervene, to let leave the cycles alone. That's the argument against Keynes that some economists levy. There's also a question, of course, about the volume of the intervention, the scale of the intervention, and that's also an issue that needs to be taken on board. It could put in too much or not enough. So there's a secondary issue there. Now, the value of GNP, gross national product, varies over time, sometimes increasing and sometimes decreasing. So the problem with the business cycle is that there are information lags in the statistics. Statistics are always out of date. It takes time to collect data. It takes time to collate and analyze the data. And even when you've done that, you might find some data is missing, or there might be errors in the collection. Indeed, the techniques used for analyzing the data may be inappropriate. So there are all sorts of issues in terms of the types of lags that are occurring with the data. There's also, as I said, the issue of how much intervention. Well, if you ignore the problem of the bad data or the obsolete data, it's still necessary to decide how much should we put in. So that's not one that can be easily answered. It's really an issue for the government to make a decision, and if it gets it wrong, we will criticize it, and if it gets it right, it will be re-elected, I guess. Now, the problem of timing and these lags, well, the first lag in timing is the administrative time. Even if the data is correct and the government acts on it and has got the right scale of intervention, it still takes time. It takes time to get the information processed in the various government departments, to get expenditure rolling, to cut taxes, and it needs a decision time. The government has to meet and think about it. So just looking at the data, deciding on what to do, government meets, makes decision, consults with experts in the area, it all takes time, and they might also have to consult with the public if it involves new public construction, perhaps new roads or new buildings or changes to some existing buildings, that sort of thing. So again, problem with timing and with lags. And projects themselves have a time scale. They don't just develop. They have to be worked out carefully with experts, with engineers, and so on. So, using fiscal intervention to solve the problem of unemployment or to smooth out the business cycle is not that simple. There are many issues to be concerned with and many issues to consider. We look at this more fully in other classes on the course and in this series. In the meantime, thank you for watching.